Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show on this Tuesday, June 8th, 2021. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan coming to you from the National Weather Service on behalf of our partners in public television. And we are certainly grateful for you to join us this evening. And if ever you want additional weather information, always check out online weather.gov/Alaska. And the old-fashioned way, get a recorded phone line forecast at 1-800-472-0391. Well, once again today we don't have any significant weather advisories, watches, or warnings in effect in the state, though we are watching the east central areas along the Canadian border where a few isolated scattered thunderstorms have developed, some of which could produce some small hail because the freezing level this time of the year is lower. And out along the west coast there continues to be a bit of a mixed precipitation off the end there, the Seward Peninsulas and the northwest coast there up around Point Hope as low pressure begins to pull away out into the Chukchi Sea. Well, taking a look at the satellite imagery this afternoon, you'll be able to see that areas of the southeast panhandle have seen some sunshine, and that's allowed Juneau, Haines, those areas, the northern waterways, to warm up nicely. You'll see those temperatures coming up in the forecast here for midweek. Also, you'll notice some thunderstorms that have formed. Those clouds enhanced brighter white tops of some showers and thunderstorms there along the east central border with Canada on over toward Dawson. And then as we go further west, there's that area of low pressure pulling away from Kotzebue Sound that has been kind of sitting over much of that area for the last week, as a couple other areas of low pressure are moving through eastern Russia and are going to kind of pinwheel and pull that one back. Meanwhile, low pressure has moved out of the eastern Aleutians and is crossing the tip of the Alaska Peninsula down there towards Sand Point and will bypass Kodiak Island well to the south and largely past the Gulf of Alaska as we head through the midweek. Nevertheless, though, the occluded front as it's lifted northward has spread clouds up into south central areas, including all of Cook Inlet up through the Kenai. And with it, we have some bands of mainly light rain and fog associated with that, while scattered showers continue along the Alaska Range back up into portions of the lower half of the Yukon River Valley. So on today's weather map, you see those thermal lows continuing in the northeast into northwest Canada with a few scattered isolated thunderstorms. And then back to the west, there's a couple areas of low pressure out there in far eastern Russia, and they'll kind of just pinwheel wobble around with a couple troughs of low pressure rotating through here in the next couple of days as you see the maps unfold. And then there's the low working its way now across the tip of the Alaska Peninsula with the occluded front lifting northward. That front and area of low pressure will be in a weakening phase here as we head through the day Wednesday and Thursday, and then as it heads southeastward, we'll begin to pull away from the region, but still expect some areas of light rain along the coast, especially the Pacific and Gulf side of the Kenai down through the southwest peninsula. And then back across the interior, still a few lighter, widely scattered showers kind of falls off at night with a little bit of mixed precipitation along the coast there, the Seward Peninsula on up into the northwest coast. On Wednesday, still a potential for isolated thunderstorm along east central areas, east of Fairbanks down toward Northway, and still some scattered showers back across pretty much the northwest half of the state, including the Alaska Range with some patchy light rain and fog continuing down there from the Kenai south along the Alaska Peninsula. Ridge of high pressure that's been sitting over the southeast coast there of the Panhandle will begin to weaken, but nevertheless, it's going to try and build a bit across the east side of the state on Thursday into Friday, which should allow for more sunshine to begin to break back out in areas that had this cloud cover come back in south central areas this week. So, looking at low temperatures, Wednesday morning lows across the southeast Panhandle and south central areas will generally be in the low and mid 40s. As we go through Wednesday afternoon, any sun could kick temperatures up to about 67 at Juneau and Haines, 63 at Glen Allen, And elsewhere, everyone else pretty much staying lower 50s, coastal areas, a little warmer as you get inland. And then lows Thursday morning, generally again in the low and mid 40s, high temperatures. Thursday afternoon may still be able to eke out 67 there at Haines. Otherwise, getting back up to 65, Talkeetna, 68, Glen Allen, with a little more sun trying to break through as that high pressure ridge builds in. For Wednesday morning along the Arctic coast, lows will be near or a bit below freezing, as they will be as you drop down along the west end of the Seward Peninsula. Lows across the Yukon Valley, generally in the 40s. And then high temperatures Wednesday afternoon could be up to as warm as 75 at Eagle Village, 70 at Fort Yukon. That's where the warmest temperatures will be, in instability for a few isolated thunderstorms that could pop up along with some scattered showers. And then Thursday morning lows will generally be around or even a bit above freezing there along the Arctic coast, generally 40s in the Yukon River Valley, and high temperatures out there through east central areas should still be up around 70, maybe even lower 70s in a few spots, with coolest readings in the upper 30s to around 40 along the northwest coast, extending into the west end of the Seward Peninsula. Along the southwest coast, we are looking for lows tonight, generally in the lower 40s, though upper 30s there along the Yukon Delta. And then high temperatures confined to generally the upper 40s to lower 50s, with the exception as you get up further through the McGrath, 56, and as we go on up through Thursday morning, lows again generally in the lower 40s, a few 30s there, again Yukon Delta on up towards St. Lawrence Island. And then Thursday afternoon temperatures should be able to get back up into the 50s in most areas, and only near 50 through the Aleutians. Quick check temperature outlook. Above normal temperatures, especially east central areas, June 14th through the 18th, maybe the first 80-degree reading there at Fort Yukon or at Eagle Village. And precipitation should generally average near to a bit above normal, with the greatest potential for that being along portions of the west-southwest coast.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Here's your flying weather for planning purposes. If you have a flight in mind here for Wednesday or Thursday, we are going to watch an area of low pressure passing south of Kodiak Island as we head through the day on Wednesday, and generally bypassing the Gulf of Alaska as it drifts more to the south and east. Meanwhile, weak low pressure that's been sitting and spinning up there around the Bering Strait, lower Chukchi Sea, will remain in place with a colder pool layer of aloft. Meanwhile, the east side of the state will see weak high pressure building in as we head through Thursday. So starting Wednesday morning, IFR conditions hugging along the Arctic coast, with the most expansive area through the southwest, including the Alaska Peninsula, east side of the Kenai and Kodiak Island, with other areas out over the central Bering. By Wednesday afternoon, we'll see still IFR conditions off the Arctic coast, hugging along the west coastline, including the Seward Peninsula, and a decreasing area of IFR conditions there at the mouth of Cook Inlet along the eastern Kenai and Kodiak Island, extending back out over the Bering Sea. There could be an isolated thunderstorm, especially along east central areas with the Canadian border during the afternoon, with the daytime heating. And then into Thursday morning, IFR conditions along parts just off the Arctic coast and along the northwest coast, Seward Peninsula. Areas of IFR decreasing there down there toward the mouth of Cook Inlet and Kodiak Island, with areas of IFR extending off of the southwest coast into the Bering Sea. And a large area of VFR conditions opening up there with weak high pressure over the east half of the state. And that'll be the case Thursday afternoon. Generally, VFR conditions expected there across the eastern half of the state, with IFR hugging portions of the northeast Arctic coast along the west coast from portions of the Seward Peninsula down toward Nunavik Island, and then perhaps lingering in a few areas there between Shelikof Strait area. So past conditions, Anaktuvik, MVFR becoming VFR, and that'll be the case at Adigan on Wednesday. And then Lake Clark and Merrill generally stay in IFR conditions, though not impossible. There could be start to break out into MVFR as we head through later in the afternoon. Rainy Pass, IFR becoming MVFR. And same thing for Windy Pass, starting out IFR but becoming MVFR. And for Isabel, holding on to generally VFR conditions during the day on Wednesday, and that'll be the case at Mentasta, though especially by afternoon if you're on the north entrance and you're kind of peering off to the northwest where the Canadian border, you could see a few cumulus buildups and perhaps isolated thunderstorms. And as we head on down toward Tanita, VFR conditions becoming MVFR. And Portage will start out IFR trying to become MVFR, especially the east entrance, as usually the case. And generally there in the north end of the inner waterways, we're looking at Chilkoot and White VFR on Wednesday. Freezing levels are lowest there over the Chukchi Sea, just northwest of the Seward Peninsula. And then highest coming up on the east central areas, 8,000 feet along the Canadian border, as well as once you get down toward the south end of Kodiak Island and along the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula. Icing potential will exist above 2,000 feet over especially the Chukchi Sea along the northwest coast, 6,000 to 12,000 feet along portions of the lower and middle Yukon Valley, and then 8,000 to 16,000 feet across the, at least the near the mainland of the Alaska Peninsula, including Kodiak Island and the Kenai. And as we look at the jet stream level winds, we see weak low pressure circulation there southeast of Kodiak Island, another one up in eastern Russia, in the Chukchi Sea, and a weak high pressure circulation over the southeast coastal areas, with the maximum jet stream level winds along the central and western Aleutians upwards to 130 knots. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, low pressure circulation continues there southeast of Kodiak Island with winds ahead of it from the south at 30 knots along south central coast and southeast coast. Areas in the northwest could see winds of 40 knots from the southwest along the northwest coast, and then on the backside of the low down there across the far eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula out of the northwest at 40 knots. And finally coming down to 3,000 feet, low pressure circulation remains southeast of Kodiak Island with southeast winds ahead of it into Cook Inlet upwards to 40 knots on the backside, north winds at 40 knots. And then a quick check to see here, turbulence between surface and 3,000 feet over the tip of the Alaska Peninsula and surface to 4,000 feet around the mouth of Cook Inlet back into the southwest.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course, They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, The big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Well, in today's marine weather, to start out, we'll check out the sea ice edge, and we continue to see the Arctic regions beginning to really melt out and the ice breaking up, with a lot of open water developing now in through the Bering Strait and up into the lower Chukchi Sea, and even extending up along the Arctic coast there in the far north. We are seeing areas beginning to break up and open, especially along where the main rivers come on in at the coast. And we expect this trend to continue, with temperatures averaging above normal now as we head through mid-month. That will likely accelerate the process. Otherwise, Wednesday's marine forecast for the southeast, we are looking for the inner waterways winds of 10 to 20 knots, waves generally running a few feet, generally from the southerly direction. In the case there out along the Gulf side of things, winds out of the south and southeast at about 10 to 15 knots and swells 5, maybe 6 feet. On Thursday, look for the inner waterways winds to be south to southeast around 15 knots, waves running a few feet. And then again along the Gulf Coast areas, swells generally 7 feet with southeast to east winds at 15 to 20 knots. And then for south central areas, winds will be strongest at the mouth of Cook Inlet down to just north of Kodiak Island out of the east, 30 knots with swells of 8 to 11 feet elsewhere. As we get up into Prince William Sound, winds out of the east at 15 knots and waves only a few feet, because low pressure is passing well south and southeast then of Kodiak Island, largely bypassing the Gulf of Alaska. And winds will come down in the interior areas only out of the east at about 10 knots on Thursday. With coastal areas there, we're looking at east to northeast winds around 20 knots and swells of 6 feet or so off of Kenai and the north end of Kodiak Island. For Wednesday, look for winds out of the northeast and north on the backside of the low at around 25 knots. So they still could be briefly upwards to around 35 knots off of Sand Point with some 10-foot swells. Otherwise, elsewhere, we're looking at around 7-foot swells. And on the Bering side, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots as you get down toward Cold Bay, and swells up to 8 feet. For Thursday, winds are going to try to go around more to the west on the Bering side at 10 to 15 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. But on the North Pacific and Gulf side, winds will be still turning more around to the north and then northwest at 15 to 20 knots, and swells generally between 5 and 8 feet. Throughout The Aleutian chain winds will start out in the eastern Aleutians, mainly from the west, at about 15 to 25 knots, and they'll continue to diminish as that low pressure pulls away. And then across the western end, winds out of the southwest at 20 knots, and waves swells around 5 feet. As we go into Thursday, look for west to southwest winds, generally around 15 knots, and swells either side of the Bering or the North Pacific between 4 and 6 feet. Along the west coast, the open waters around St. Paul, St. George, and south of St. Matthew, southwest to west winds 20 knots, swells 7 feet. Lesser, more southwest winds along the west coast there, and swells of 4 to 5 feet. And then as we head into Thursday, winds will try to turn more to the southerly direction once you get north of Nunavik Island, and generally swells ranging 3 to 5 feet from Norton Sound out toward north of Nunavik Island, and upwards to 8 feet south of St. Matthew Island. Finally, along the Arctic coast, easterly winds around 10 to 15 knots, so they have come down. And offshore flow from the southeast, there out of Kotzebue Sound at 15 to 20 knots, and waves 4 feet. For Thursday then, winds across the Arctic coastline more out of the southeast at 5 to 10 knots, and more southerly at 15 to 20 knots, with waves around 3 feet where there is open water there in the lower Chukchi Sea. And a quick check of the map shows that low pressure passing well southeast of Kodiak Island, largely bypassing the Gulf of Alaska, though there'll still be some bands of light rain and fog extending up toward the Kenai, Kodiak Island, and off the south central coast. And then as we go into the day Thursday, just a lingering trough of low pressure back toward the Gulf and North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, with weak high pressure along the southeast coast there. And we'll see a ridge of high pressure trying to rebuild up into portions of the eastern half of the state here to round out the week, as another area of low pressure pinwheels out of far eastern Russia with a couple of troughs of low pressure. So that's our show for this Tuesday evening. Thank you for watching. As always, we appreciate you tuning in each night.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.